He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. Well, everybody applauds the real deep dive investigative journalism that lifts the lid on stuff that we need to know, but it's expensive and it takes more time and money than many of our media can afford these days. But there is still some finance for that from those with the means who see the value in it. This week we talked to two journalists who oversee one of the biggest philanthropic funds financing investigative reporting, the legacy of a finance professional who was also a bit of a journalist himself.
If we could hire a forensic accountant for the next 3 weeks, we could get to the bottom of this a hell of a lot quicker than we're ever going to be able to do in the newsroom. If we could go to Europe tomorrow, the ability to do that to strike while the iron's hot, it not only feels more like what journalism is actually like, it also feels much more like what Brian would do.
They tell us which new investigations are getting bankrolled by the fund this year and why they're now looking for new ways to make it matter more in the future. Also on Mediawatch this week, we look at how publishers running paid promotional content for cash can risk their reputation without control of what actually ends up on their site. But first this week on Mediawatch, the government's plan to give out golden visas to the wealthy offshore in order to boost economic growth here got heaps of headlines this week, but predictably also a bit of a backlash.
This year is all about growth. Going for growth. Growth. Unlock growth.
To grow our economy faster.
Prime Minister Christopher Luxon and Finance Minister Nicola Willis have made it very clear the government's focus for 2025 boils down to that one word.
That was Jack Tame last Sunday on the first TVNZ Q&A show of this year, talking about the Prime Minister as a man with a mission and a simple message: economic growth is top priority. By Wednesday, that mantra had been superseded by a supercut of this.
There was just one name on the lips of MPs in the House today.
David Seymour.
The Honourable David Seymour.
David Seymour.
Mr Seymour.
Mr Seymour.
David Seymour.
David Seymour driving up the front stairs of Parliament, and his tit-for-tat with the Prime Minister over the 2022 letter of support to the police over Philip Polkinghorne dominated the discourse today.
And it was a similar story on Tuesday.
Puppeteer rather than a leader. Does he spend too much time controlling his coalition partners rather than leading the country? I think he might.
Mr Speaker, it would be the easiest thing in the world for me to just stand up and say that there's been no such donation to me, but I'm not going to do that.
Okay, well, why not?
We don't know, but, anyway.
And the David Seymour show was still running on Wednesday night's news.
Day 3 of defending David's joyride.
Issue for the Speaker. Made my comments clear on Monday about it.
Footage captured by TVNZ shows David Seymour was warned by the organiser they did not have permission to cruise up Parliament steps.
We've been told to keep off the steps.
Twice.
We've been told by security that we cannot go on the steps.
But before David Seymour's domination of the discourse, as ZB's political editor Jason Walls had put it there, the media management of the government's latest economic growth initiative, the Active Investor Plus Visa, hogged the headlines last weekend and all through Monday. The Prime Minister's announcement of the so-called golden visas, which target offshore investors willing to risk $5 million or more, was carried live on the news websites of our major media last Sunday. And on TVNZ's One News at 6, it was second only to that spat with the Cook Islands, and likewise on 3 News.
The Prime Minister and his Economic Growth Minister this afternoon revealed an overhaul of the Golden Visa scheme. But as Ruwani Pereira reports, some immigration experts reckons the changes don't go far enough.
But Stuff readers knew it was coming the day before that. National Affairs correspondent Andrea Vance said the Immigration Minister Erica Stanford had already told the Post that the visas would be coming. And on Monday, that led the morning news again on News Talk ZB.
I'm Nivareti Manu. A former Economic Development Minister says there's nothing to fear from overseas investors. Former Labour Minister Stuart Nash told Mike Hosking, "We don't have the people to grow world-leading companies, but overseas investors can contribute to the community."
To get your Active Investor Plus visa, you've had to pass the good character test. Your wealth has got to be proven as coming from legitimate sources. These are good people. They add value.
Now, former Minister Stuart Nash has skin in this game. After leaving politics, he became the commercial director here for the global headhunting and recruitment firm Robert Walter. But the golden visa story also led RNZ's midday news on Monday, highlighting this wrinkle.
New rules for so-called golden visas attracting wealthy investors means some people will only need to be in the country for 1 week a year to gain residency.
And after that, RNZ's business editor Giles Beckford had a different perspective in the same bulletin.
Well, it's interesting that New Zealand should be looking to liberalise the golden visa rules at a time when a lot of other countries, particularly in Europe, have actually been tightening theirs or scrapping the programs altogether. Now, they're motivated by different reasons, but in particular in Europe, the concerns are about money laundering and in particular undesirable, should we say, arising out of Russia, Belarus involvement in the Ukraine war. So from that point of view, a lot of European countries and some others in particular have been concerned about that influx, the sort of people that they're getting.
And on the same morning on News Talk ZB's Wellington morning show, the host Nick Mills was worried about that too.
I would be concerned if the oligarchs started appearing from Russia. They're Russian, aren't they? They're all Russian oligarchs. They're Russian, very, very wealthy Russian people that no one knows where they get their money from. I mean, we're opening the doors. There's going to be a couple of sneaky ones that come through that shouldn't have come through, isn't there?
But it wasn't so much how they make their money or where they come from that worried Nick Mills. It was this.
We damn well should speak English. We need to speak some sort of English to do any kind of business in New Zealand.
But do we? You'd think that a golden visa holder could invest $5 million or more pretty easily with an English-speaking helper here, but Nick Mills' anxiety about dropping the English language visa requirement turns out was shared by ZB callers like Deborah.
When I read it in the newspaper, my heart just went, oh no, I want them to speak English. I don't want people to come here and, I don't know, if we get too many of them, our language, English, gets diminished. And as you say, when you're talking about employees coming to help fix up things in your businesses, it's just terrible if you can't understand them.
Now, it's not really likely that any immigrant fixing up plumbing problems or deliveries at Nick Mills' hospo businesses would be active Investor Plus visa holders, but it wasn't really just the language worrying Deborah.
I don't want people to come here for a couple of years and start pushing their culture or their political belief realm on us. I want to lessen that power.
Good on you. That's your view, Deborah. I'm sure there's
Have a lovely day, everybody in New Zealand.
And it's a shame there no one pointed out that the English language requirement actually remains for most would-be immigrants outside that special class created for the new visa. But the possibility of more diversity also triggered caller Trevor.
Cultural problems and diversities have come with other beliefs and other languages. You know, New Zealand and Australia, they were all British, so we had, not 100%, but we had the Christianity, values, we all spoke the same language, and life was a lot simpler.
And especially so at Easter time, according to Trevor.
You know, now, when you go buy Cadbury's Easter egg, it hasn't got Easter on it, because we don't want to offend other cultures. Just things like that are the sort of counter towards immigration. And as I say, I'll never buy another Cadbury Easter egg again, Cadbury Easter egg again.
Well, it is part of commercial culture these days that Easter stuff is already on sale in some stores now, even though we're not even halfway through February. And a quick check of supermarket shelves and their websites shows that the word Easter is still on Cadbury's Easter eggs packaging. Cadbury's Easter eggs, by the way, are no longer made here. Global owner Mondelez moved Dunedin's production to Melbourne years ago in circumstances that really did cause some Kiwis to turn their back on the brand. But why was it that Trevor thought that not offending other faiths had caused Cadbury to erase Easter here? Well, it's likely that Trevor has been misinformed by stories that were circulating 8 years ago in the birthplace of Cadbury, the UK. In 2016, the country's least reputable tabloid, The Daily Star, reported that Cadbury had banned Easter on the packaging of its products in order to stop offending other religions, and they said they had the pictures to prove it. But not so, said the company, pointing out that Easter was on the back of some of the packets that the paper had pictured, but not on the front. So why did Cadbury de-Easterify the front of the packets? A spokesman told The Star,
because it's very obvious through the packaging that it is an Easter egg.
Sometimes the simple answer really is the most likely. In the end, it didn't take much work to contradict the claim that Cadbury had entirely erased Easter from its eggs, or to establish that supermarkets stocking them are also not offering faith-free hot plus-sign buns or anything like that. But it can take much more journalistic effort to overturn other dodgy claims. Late last year on Mediawatch, we had a long chat with Jonathan Milne. He's the editor of the online news service for subscribers, Newsroom Pro. And most of that chat was about his 10-part investigative podcast series called Powder Keg, in which he chased down an elusive Kiwi entrepreneur, Chris Ashenden. In fact, he chased him all the way down to Colombia to tell the story that Chris Ashenden really didn't want out there.
We follow charismatic Chris the Kiwi Ashenden from the streets of Colombia.
The next thing I see is there's a gun in the car.
To high-end hotels in Mexico.
You guys from AG1?
Yes, sir.
I'm Jonathan Milne from Newsroom. I emailed you to set up the interview.
Jonathan, what are you doing here, sir?
Following you, you guys never replied.
From my dealings with Chris, he's not a con artist.
And yet you refuse to disclose the truth about your background.
A decision not to investigate athletics greens does not endorse.
Now, that deep dive into the big business of AG1 supplement powder required deep pockets. And as we've heard a lot these days, most of our media just don't have the means to fund that sort of thing anymore. And the money for that sort of series came from a special source, the Brian Gaynor Business Journalism Initiative. Now, Brian Gaynor was a founder and long-time leader of the wealth manager and KiwiSaver provider Milford Asset Management, and that was declared at the end of every column that Brian wrote in the Weekend Herald for many years. In fact, Brian often had to write about the businesses in which he had a stake, and often in ways that didn't please those businesses. But all that came to a sad end in 2022 when Brian died. However, a $2 million endowment set up in his honour by his family has created the Brian Gaynor Business Journalism Initiative to fund investigative journalism with an economic or business focus. Now, Brian Gaynor was also an investor in and supporter of the subscriber news service Business Desk, which was founded by veteran journalist Patrick Smelly. He's now part of the Brian Gaynor Initiative panel, which oversees the journalism funding, and so is his colleague Nikki Mando. And this week, they both joined myself and Mediawatch's Hayden Donnell to tell us how they want the Brian Gaynor Initiative Fund to change, and also to reveal who or what are the latest recipients of the fund that is Brian Gaynor's legacy, or at least to tell us as much about those projects as they can.
It's really down to his widow, Anna Gibbons, who decided that Anna has set aside a $2 million putia to allow the funding on an annual basis of an unknown number of business journalism projects of unknown scope and size, which at the moment we take an annual application process for. This is the second time we've done it. You know, it's taken a little while for everybody to get their heads around exactly how it can be made most useful.
Well, I think we've been a bit surprised, haven't we, that it's, you know, the ones that we funded have been amazing. Jonathan Milne from Newsroom's podcast last year was fantastic, but we haven't had as many as we thought we'd have.
That's a really good example, isn't it, Jonathan Milne's one, because that was tens of thousands of dollars. It had to be added to when the scope of the project, you know, became clear. He needed lab testing, extra overseas travel, all of that sort of thing. But also, Nikki, you couldn't have said we are awarding a Brian Gaynor Business Journalism Initiative grant to Jonathan to investigate Chris Ashenden and AGI, because that would have given the game away, right?
Quite apart from anything else, you've got to operate with that degree of integrity, because there's at least one journalist, me, on the selection panel, and any suggestion that the panel was going to leak the investigation to other people in the media who might have a crack at it first would be fatal for them.
And weirdly, I mean, I suppose there's perhaps not really the same thing, but a kind of an echo in the way that Brian Gaynor himself had to operate, right? Because he was at Milford Asset Management. He had to declare that in every column, and he was writing about companies and operations. Sometimes it might have been against his financial interests, but maybe not.
In a way, that's one of the reasons why I think it's Brian's name attached to this gives it a degree of credibility, because love him or loathe him, and there are plenty of people who felt both ways about Brian and the financial markets. He was without fear or favour in terms of what he wrote, irrespective of what his underlying investment position or Milford's position might have been. And that's really what we want to try and encourage, is that kind of fearless ability to go deep on things.
And Nikki, you're on the selection panel too, right? Do you sometimes have to have difficult conversations with Patrick or others about the sort of projects and, whether you can agree on the investigative value of it, and indeed, as Patrick was saying, the need to keep some of that under your hat?
Certainly, I mean, the keeping it under your hat is easy. You announce rather a generic thing, somebody is going to investigate plastic waste, for example. One of the ones that we've given money to this year is you're not going to say this exactly is what this journalist is going to do and where they're going to go and what they're going to try and achieve. You just say it's about plastic waste and you leave it at that, and that's fine. The projects that we funded have been amazing, but we haven't had as many amazing projects as we thought we would have, and that's why we're trying to think, how do we change the way we do it? Or is it that if you do it on an annual basis, all you're doing is asking for somebody to try and scoot around and try and find a project that they could do? Whereas what you perhaps want is people to be, we would like to go to the Cook Islands right now to investigate this thing that's going on at the moment. And perhaps that's a better way of doing it.
So how will you make that judgment, Patrick?
Well, we're going out in the next few days to seek feedback, really, from the business journalism community and editors, with that proposal in mind. What made me think about this was two things. One is that there are an enormous number of things that you can apply for or enter as a journalist. Sometimes it feels as if it's just a rote process. You think, oh, well, okay, it's time for the Voyagers. I'll try and find 3 stories that I liked. It would be much better if you were able to say, crikey, this is a good story, but how are we going to get to do this?
Yeah, but the Voyagers are awards for work you've already done, right? This is different.
This is. But the sense, though, is that the application for these awards just becomes another of those things. Whereas we really wanted to stand out as a unique opportunity in New Zealand business journalism to say, if we could hire a forensic accountant for the next 3 weeks, we could get to the bottom of this a hell of a lot quicker than we're ever going to be able to do in the newsroom. If we could go to Europe tomorrow, because we know that the person we need to see is now hiding out and blah, 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 we're not going to say yes to everything, obviously, but the ability to do that to strike while the iron's hot not only feels more like what journalism is actually like, it also feels much more like what Brian would do. A very strategic person, but he was also, at times, incredibly loose. He hated process. I keep thinking about that in the context of this thing. Process is much less important than impact.
That does sound really good, but I do wonder whether it can't address some of the structural things that are the problem here, which is that it feels like there's very few freelancers knocking about and it's not really a viable career. So the people that are really thinking of this kind of project and really trying to hunt for them, they're few and far between. They might not exist.
Well, some of them do. I mean, it's Cecile Meyer, who's, she does most of her work for Business Desk at the moment. She's freelance, though.
I'm part-time at Mediawatch and I'm part-time as a freelancer, and I just kind of don't know how people that really do it full-time as a freelancer make it viable with the rates as they are now and the number of opportunities, because this kind of opportunity would be great. You get this big payday once, but then it's how do you fill it up with all the other opportunities that might not be out there?
But I don't know why you're whinging, because here we are, we're kind of saying, look, here is an opportunity. I was a freelancer and I hated it. You did all the boring shit that nobody else wanted to do. So this is the opportunity. If you were a freelancer and you had a really great story that was going to take a month, normally you couldn't do that, but this time you could.
Great. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying this is bad for freelancers. This would be great if there was more of this sort of thing out there. But then I think that the newsroom budgets have been cut back quite a lot, and the freelance budgets are not there. It's certainly not at the levels that they used to, particularly in the more niche topics like lifestyle or music. There is more money floating about in business. I'm not a business journalist.
I think you're arguing the wrong way, because I think if you cut the budgets of the newsroom, Hayden goes to a newsroom with a free story, says, look, I have this cracking story, and you're not going to have to pay for it because I'm being paid by the Brian Gaynor initiative or another sort of initiative, then I'm sure that people are going to take it, and you would counteract this problem with newsrooms.
That brings us on to another of the things that we're thinking about, which is there are a bunch of sums of money floating around which are intended for journalism projects. And I've been surprised to stumble across them, having been a journalist for, God knows how many years, only finding out about them because of my involvement with this Brian Gaynor initiatives. Is there a case, though, for creating some kind of central repository for these opportunities so that they can be seen in one place?
And that would match up with what you were saying about people could launch an application at any time while the iron was hot.
Potentially. I mean, you could. I'm aware of at least one potential philanthropic funding initiative for journalism of a much wider character than business journalism. They think that money's there. The thing they didn't know how to do was to operationalise it. So,
and this was a broadcast journalist. You may have heard of him, Peter Ackland. I don't know. He was a broadcast journalist, and there's a foundation there, but I'd never heard of it. Perhaps you could bring these all together.
Well, what if the story might be, or the idea might be, a bit of a long shot? For example, when New Zealand On Air apportions money of a particularly substantial sums for a project, they want the green light already from a publisher or broadcaster so that the dollars end up on the whatever screen it ends up on. Is that a consideration for you, that
yes,
it might be something to investigate and you might end up with no story?
With Powderkeg and Newsroom, we said we'll pay you in tranches, but at about they think they gave us a 4-month timetable for the thing. And I said, well, at the 2-month mark, tell us whether you really think you've got a story or not. And if there's not a story there, okay, we might have done 20k of the 45, but that's the risk you always take in journalism. We do try to manage that risk by not necessarily paying all the money at once. Is it bearing fruit or not?
Mm. And seeing as we're using that as an example, I mean, I remember Jonathan telling us that initially he thought it might be a sort of local boy, done good internationally type story. Does it have to be something that's a lid lifting, or can it be just something that's interesting?
Rather it was lid lifting.
I think it has to be lid lifting.
Yeah.
I think we've had proposals that have not been lid lifting. We would not have funded Jonathan to do that story, the original story, what a splendid guy who's doing really well in the States. We wanted him to be stalking him in the streets of Colombia, which is, what ended up happening.
Actually, before we go much further, perhaps we should, rather than keep people on tenterhooks, have you tell us as much as you can about these lid-lifting projects that we funded in 2025 from the Brian Gaynor Business Journalism Initiative.
There are 2 investigative awards. One is to Cecile Mar for a project which relates to plastic recycling. The other is to Consumer Magazine, and is perhaps less lid-lifting than just a deep investigation into something which needs to be talked about, which is what is it going to cost to insure a home in New Zealand in the next 10 to 50 years. So relevant, and the expectation there is if we fund it, we want Consumer to make that as publicly available as possible. So they may get it for a couple of weeks behind their paywall, but as with anything that goes behind a paywall, eventually if we funded it, it has to come out from behind the paywall. The other sort of flip side of this thing, we're very keen to find strong local and international educational opportunities. So Hamish McNichol, from one of the co-editors at National Business Review, will be doing a distance course for the London School of Economics, which is basically to supercharge his ability to understand company accounts. I think is really what it boils down to. One of the conditions there is we want him to talk to the journalistic community after he's done it, but also to recommend to us, was this a really useful course? Because you can do it from New Zealand. It's quite expensive. Maybe we would look to do that for 4 or 5 business journalists a year if it's really valuable. The other is Matt Nippert, investigative journalist at the New Zealand Herald, who's going to the Bellingcat organisation. If you've never heard of them, think of the people who found out where the missile that brought down the plane over Ukraine. It's those people.
For sure.
They use open source.
Yes.
Open
source use of AI, basically. So there's a course in London on that, and Matt is going to apply that to a story that he's working on as well, which you can't really talk about.
I'm gutted that Cecile's got that plastic waste story. I'm
you
very
wrote about
happy
it in
for
New
her.
Zealand Geographic,
I was
didn't
gutted.
you?
Yeah, I did a feature about recycling, which drew on a lot of her work for New Zealand Geographic, and I got so interested in plastic waste, and it is a great story. Do you think part of the reason why you don't get many applications for this is that people's employers won't release them or can't release them for a month to do some investigative work like this?
Or maybe the journalists don't even want to ask.
When I started in journalism in New Zealand, something like Metro, you might spend 2 months working on a feature. Now you're working on 2 stories a day, 3 stories a day. And I think it is a huge problem because instead of losing a journalist who's producing 1 story, you're losing a journalist that might be producing 15 stories.
And you've got to replace them somehow, but then there's not as many people in the market to do that.
Well, there are a few more now than there used to be.
Yeah, well, there's probably actually quite a few looking about, actually, when you think about it, yeah.
I don't think that's much of an impediment, actually. I don't think that's affecting how people think about it. I think it's more that not a lot of people get the opportunity to do something so deep, and so maybe don't think in terms of projects that might take weeks or months at a time.
If I'm trying to channel the brain of someone that's in a newsroom, you're doing 2 stories a day, or you're pumping out, if you're a digital journalist, you might be doing like
you just
10
don't
press
think that way.
releases. You're just not thinking, here's my great long-form feature idea that has been brewing in my mind. You're just so
But every now and
exhausted
again, you
by
come
the end of
across
the day.
something and it's so compelling, you think, if only we could ...
If you're a senior journalist or a mid-range journalist, you actually want to have some grunty projects to work on from time to time. And I think this gives journalists the chance to do those sorts of really cool projects.
I just wonder whether they don't have the mental space to think of really grunty ideas, whether you're just kind of on the hamster wheel every day and you don't have that.
That's what the ability to strike with the irons hot is intended to try to overcome. If you suddenly come across something that you think, we haven't got the budget for this because I know what the news environment's like, but if we did...
This will allow you, because we'll pay your salary for 2 weeks, say.
So you want editors, you want journalists to feed back and tell you what they think would be the best use of this money?
Or what's the best way to have it available to them?
I mean, the Public Interest Journalism Fund, it wasn't universally loved, but it did seem to be pretty well subscribed by organisations. Maybe that would make the profession more viable for people. Because, as you say, this kind of thing is great. A Hayden could go to the newsroom and say, look, I've got this, I could get funding to do it for a month.
And I'd certainly give my backing to anything that got Hayden out of the country and possibly
I'm hoping
a
that
dangerous
I
story
can
over some
finally quit
lengthy
this
period
thing,
of time.
you know? If I just need a few more of these funds and I can get out of Colin's orbit.
That proposal's not going to fly.
That was Business Desk founder Patrick Smelly and his former colleague Nikki Mando, both veteran business journalists and now both part of the panel that oversees the Brian Gaynor Business Journalism Initiative, which, as you heard there, dispenses funds to journalists with investigative projects that need financial backing. And as you also heard there, they want more applications to the fund and more ideas for other ways in which the endowment from the late Brian Gaynor could count for more in our media. So if you have some ideas, get in touch. They're all ears. As we've been speaking of tough times for our media, when the current Minister of Media, Paul Goldsmith, got that job in April last year, he told RNZ that he knew there were problems and that the need for action was urgent.
All around the world, the various elements of the media, some are struggling, and some real challenges out there. So part of the solution is to try and level the playing field as best we can between what you might describe as traditional providers and the streamers, recognising that people's behaviours have changed, and so there has to be adaptation as well. So it will take a little bit of time, but I'm conscious of the fact that there's some urgency in some matters that we've got to deal with.
And this week, 10 months on, Paul Goldsmith was saying some of the same things when he finally unveiled proposals to ease some of the pressures.
The government has released some draft proposals which it says may help level the playing field for local media. The 5 proposals include requiring streaming platforms to invest in local content and display it prominently, increasing closed captioning and audio descriptions, and merging New Zealand On Air and the Film Commission.
Now that last one there was no surprise, so much so that both of those bodies put out a joint statement almost immediately, welcoming the move, and so did the Broadcasting Standards Authority, which has also agitated for years for more action on reform of media regulation, which they said was long overdue in the digital era. Now, some of the changes, like local production conditions on streaming services, could make a big difference for local media makers, but critics have called these moves tinkering around the edges, and they're only, remember, proposals in a discussion document. So more discussion will take more time that many in the media don't feel they have, and changes to the law which would be required, well, it would take even longer. Hayden Donnell took a look at that on Midweek Mediawatch last Wednesday, the day that the Minister made those proposals public. And they also talked about a new local news service from the Herald, which might be in the pipeline, and David Seymour pushing back at the Herald, and a TV comedian, the Speaker of Parliament, its security staff, and even his own Prime Minister. Midweek Mediawatch is on our podcast page at rnz.co.nz or in our feed for free from your preferred podcast provider. And speaking of changes to media law, what about one that's already before Parliament that really would get much needed money to our news media?
Paul Goldsmith confirmed the Fair News digital bargaining bill is on hold while he waits to see what Australia does with a similar piece of legislation.
The Australian equivalent has been in place for almost 4 years now, with successive governments here saying that they're waiting to see how it goes. And since then, Australia has moved on, introducing new laws and regulations for the media, which the Media Minister Paul Goldsmith says he's now monitoring as well. So next week here on Mediawatch, we hear from an expert in Australia about what the government is doing there about the same sort of problems and whether it makes sense for our government to follow their lead.
We're kind of slightly treading water at the moment. You know, I imagine that suits the platforms just fine, because until there's a little bit more certainty, there certainly isn't much incentive for them to be getting on and making deals with publishers.
That was Tim Burrows, owner of the media company Unmade and also the host of the new weekly news media show on Australia's ABC called Medialand. Next week he's here in New Zealand hosting a session in Auckland where media and marketing executives will discuss strategies for surviving in the media in 2025. And you can hear about that too on Mediawatch next weekend. These days, as we've just heard, commercial news media are under increasing pressure to earn money just about any way they can, and carrying paid content from outside sources is one way. Stuff that looks a bit like news but really isn't, or messages that people have paid to put in front of an audience that really is engaging with actual news. And even if that paid content is marked as such for the readers, media outlets hosting it really do need control of it. Last week, Mediawatch was pretty startled by a headline on stuff.co.nz's homepage, which said this:
"Even pro-Palestinians can't debunk this."
And clicking on that took us to a web page with a YouTube video by this guy.
Think about it. When have you ever heard the opinion of an average Israeli? Not a politician, not an activist from the far left or far right, but a middle-of-the-road Israeli. My name is Oren, I'm an Israeli tour guide, and I'm your average Israeli.
And 22 minutes later, this was the conclusion of the self-declared average Israeli Oren.
Civil wars, chaos, and hate. Peace will only come when two things happen. First, when the Arab world recognizes a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And second, when Muslim society is democratic, less violent, and more tolerant of Jews, Christians, and independent women. This is, in general, the average Israeli opinion. I think it makes sense.
Well, that video has now been viewed more than 500,000 times on YouTube alone, where it links to fundraising options and more videos from Oren, like one called "The Left and the Arab World, a Match Made in Hell." Now, Oren simply isn't a middle-of-the-road observer in Israel. It is solidly pro-Israeli opinion that he's putting out at some length. But why was that hosted on the Stuff site last weekend alongside real news and commentary? Well, because it was in the section of the site called Paid Promoted Content via Outbrain. So what's that? Well, Outbrain is a service originating in Israel that places content for clients on websites all over the world. Websites with the original articles pay Outbrain for the traffic, and Outbrain pays the websites on which the links appear. Both parties make money when readers click on them. The link that was placed on Stuff by Outbrain came via Digital Iron Dome, named after Israel's actual missile defence system. Digital Iron Dome is run by a former IDF soldier turned tech entrepreneur, Hadar Aushach, who explains it like this in another video on the same page that was linked on Stuff.
Just like a physical Iron Dome that scans the open air and watch for enemy missiles, our technology, the Digital Iron Dome, knows how to scan the internet. We know how to buy media, pro-Israeli videos and articles and images inside the very same articles that are going against Israel.
Hadar also says that Digital Iron Dome delivered pro-Jewish messages to over 100 million people worldwide on platforms like Al Jazeera and CNN, and last weekend on stuff.co.nz. Now, he says he uses technology that ensures the content remains, in his words, undetected as pro-Israel material, ensuring it reaches the right audience without interference. Now, there's nothing new about pro-Israel advertising appearing in our news media here. Campaign groups like Friends of Israel, for example, have bought space in New Zealand newspapers for years to place articles that have their point of view, and other advocacy groups do the same. But back in 2017, the Media Council ruled that some sponsored stories supplied online by Outbrain to the likes of Stuff and the Herald were the publisher's responsibility. Both media companies argued that the content was actually advertising and not news, so it wasn't under their editorial control. But the council concluded that the publishers of news websites here are accountable for promoted links that are offered to their readers. Now, back then, the publishers at Stuff and the Herald said they would do more to distinguish this content from genuine news online. And since then, Stuff has called it paid promotional content. Many users possibly just don't notice it anymore, and savvier users can easily vanish it with ad-blocking software, while others simply ignore what they accept as just an annoying side effect of the open internet, which many people think is just broadly a good thing. But this is also still a big money business, and the outfits using these tools are getting much bigger exposure from their arrangements with news publishers such as Stuff. The recently appointed Outbrain boss for Australia, New Zealand and Singapore recently described his employer like this.
Outbrain is a leader in digital media, connecting advertisers with premium audiences in contextually relevant environments.
But environments where news and neutrality are important aren't really relevant environments for political propaganda that's propagated by online opportunists who know how to make money out of it, and also to raise funds while they're at it to make more of it. These services like Outbrain are sometimes called recommendation engines, but our recommendation to news media is don't use them for the sake of the people whose trust you say you want to earn and keep, the readers. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week with more on the week's news and media. If you have any thoughts to share with us or ideas for us to follow up, do get in touch. Or if you spot anything you think we should know about, email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you can write us an old-fashioned letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123, Wellington. I'll be back next Wednesday with Midweek Media Watch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.